Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. I've been camping solo for years. There's something about the quiet, the way the wind moves through the trees, the slow ripple of water against the shore, the utter absence of human noise that makes me feel like I belong. Out there, away from people, I can breathe, I can think. But after what happened last summer, I don't think I'll ever camp alone again. I had driven deep into the Montana wilderness, hours from the nearest town, past empty roads and thick forests that swallowed the sunlight. My destination was a secluded lake, a place so remote I doubted anyone had set foot there in months. It was perfect. I set up camp near the water's edge, pitched my tent beneath the towering pines, and started a fire. The first day was peaceful. The sky burned orange and pink as the sun dipped behind the treetops, and by nightfall, the world was wrapped in darkness. The only sounds were the occasional coyote howls and the rustling leaves in the breeze. I sat by the fire, watching the embers pulse and glow, feeling the heat on my face. My mind wandered. Maybe I'd stay an extra day. Maybe two. There was no rush to get back to civilization. Then I heard footsteps. Not an animal, too heavy. Not the soft rustle of a deer or the quick scurry of a raccoon. Human footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Crunch, crunch. They came from the trees behind me, just outside the reach of the firelight. I turned sharply, my skin prickling. "Hello," I called out. My voice felt small, swallowed by the vast, empty dark. Silence. Then the sound of something stepping back, retreating deeper into the woods. I waited, heart hammering. Nothing. Just the trees, the wind, the distant lap of water. I forced a chuckle, trying to shake off the unease. Probably just my imagination, or maybe a bear sniffing around. Either way, I wasn't about to let a few noises spook me. I doused the fire and crawled into my tent, zipping myself inside. My sleeping bag was warm, the air thick with pine and damp earth. I told myself I was fine. Then, just as I started to drift off, I heard it again, closer this time. Footsteps, a slow, dragging step, then another. I held my breath. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent. Then, hello, a whisper, my voice. It was me, not similar, not close. It was my exact voice, a perfect, awful imitation. The blood in my veins turned to ice. It spoke again. "Hello." The same tone, the same pitch, but wrong. A fraction too slow, a hair too empty, like a recording played back at the wrong speed. I gripped my knife, every muscle locked. The fabric of the tent was so thin, just a flimsy barrier between me and whatever was standing out there. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Minutes crawled by. My heart pounded against my ribs, screaming at me to do something, run, scream, anything. Then, finally, footsteps, walking away, slow, measured. They faded into the trees, swallowed by the wind. I stayed awake until dawn, my knife clutched so tightly my hand ached. When the first light crept through the tent fabric, I forced myself outside, scanning the forest. No footprints. No sign that anyone, anything, had been there at all. I broke camp in under 10 minutes. I didn't eat, didn't take in the morning air. I just packed up and got the hell out of there. The entire hike back to my truck, I felt it. That pressure in the air. Like something was watching, following, mimicking. I don't know what I encountered that night, but I know one thing for certain. It walked like me. It spoke like me, but it was not me. Story 2. Oregon's forests have a kind of silence that makes you uneasy. It's not real silence, not the kind where nothing is happening. It's the kind where everything is happening, just out of sight. The trees stand tall and dark, listening, keeping secrets. I didn't realize that when Jake and I set up camp by the river that evening. But by the time the sun came up, I understood. We had hiked all day, our backs slick with sweat, our boots kicking up dry pine needles. When we found a clearing near the water, we were too exhausted to care about the creeping fog over the river or the way the frogs and crickets seemed to hush when we spoke. We pitched our tent, built a fire, roasted some hot dogs, and let the exhaustion swallow us whole. At some point in the night, the world changed. I woke up around 3 in the morning, my bladder pressing against my gut. The air inside the tent was thick and stale, smelling of sweat and burnt wood. Jake snored softly beside me, dead to the world. I groaned, grabbed my flashlight, and stumbled out into the cold night. The river shimmered under the moonlight, black and still, stretching out like a sheet of glass. The trees swayed, whispering. I stepped away from the tent, rubbing my arms against the chill. And then I heard it, a scream, not the startled yelp of an animal, not the high-pitched call of some night bird. A woman's scream, long, raw, and desperate. It echoed through the trees, bouncing between the trunks like something alive, something hunting. My blood turned to ice. I stood frozen, the flashlight trembling in my grip. My mind scrambled for an explanation, anything rational, anything other than what my gut was screaming at me. Then silence. Nothing but the river, the wind, the trees. I took a step back, then another. I forced my legs to move, slow at first, then faster until I was running back to the tent. I ducked inside, my breath coming fast and shallow. I shook Jake's shoulder hard. "Dude, wake up." He grunted, turning over. "What? Did you hear that?" I whispered. "Hear what?" He mumbled, rubbing his eyes. Before I could answer, the scream came again, closer this time. Jake sat up so fast he nearly headbutted me. What the hell was that? My hands were shaking. I reached for the knife I kept in my backpack. Jake grabbed his flashlight, flicking it on. We sat there, silent, listening. The scream didn't come again, but the forest had changed. It felt like something was waiting, watching. I unzipped the tent and peeked out. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, landing on the trees, the ground, the river. Nothing, but the air felt thick wrong. The hair on my arm stood up. Jake whispered, "You see anything?" I swallowed hard. No. Neither of us slept after that. We sat there, backs against the tent wall, listening to every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves. The night stretched long and cold. At first light, we packed up fast, shoving our gear into our bags. eyes darting to the trees. Neither of us spoke. We just wanted out. We were halfway down the trail when we ran into him. A man in his 60s, wearing a faded green jacket, a backpack slung over one shoulder. He looked like he'd been hiking these woods his whole life. He nodded at us. "Morning, boys." We barely managed a greeting. We must have looked like hell. Dark circles under our eyes, stiff movements, like we hadn't slept. He studied us for a second, then said, "You boys camp near the river." We stopped. Jake and I exchanged a glance. "Yeah," I said. The old man sighed. "Shouldn't do that." A slow, creeping dread slithered up my spine. "Why?" His expression darkened. He shifted his backpack, looking past us, toward the trees. "A woman drowned there, years ago. Some folks say she still lingers." The world felt suddenly smaller, pressing in around me. "Lingers?" I repeated, my voice barely a whisper. He nodded. "Campers hear her sometimes. Screaming." Jake's face went pale. I felt the air leave my lungs. The old man looked at us, eyes full of something I couldn't place. Pity, maybe. She was running from someone. Nobody knows who. She went into the water and never came back up. The trees swayed, and for a moment, I thought I heard it again. A scream, distant, buried in the wind. Jake grabbed my arm. "Let's go." We didn't stop, didn't look back, and we never, ever camped there again. Story 3. I was 15 the last time I went camping. After that night, I never set foot in the woods again. Some things, some places just aren't meant for us. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip. My dad was the kind of man who believed in fresh air, hard work, and the value of getting away from all that TV nonsense. So, when he said we were heading out to the Appalachian Mountains for some real bonding time, I didn't have a choice. It was me, Dad, and my little sister, Lily. She was 10, still at that age where she thought everything was a grand adventure. We hiked for most of the day, miles away from the nearest road, and set up camp in a clearing surrounded by towering pines. The first evening was peaceful enough. We built a fire, roasted some marshmallows, and listened to Dad tell the same old stories about his youth. As the night deepened, the air turned colder, and the sounds of the forest came alive. The distant hoot of an owl, the rustling of small creatures in the underbrush. Then midnight came. I don't know what woke me. Maybe it was the stillness. The fire had burned down to embers, and the world outside the tent was too quiet, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Then I felt Lily's hand on my arm, cold, trembling. I turned my head and found her staring at me, her face pale in the dim glow of the tent lantern. "There's someone outside," she whispered. I held my breath, listening. Nothing, just the occasional creak of trees swaying in the breeze. I almost told her she was imagining things, just the woods playing tricks on her. But then it came. Tap, tap, tap. A soft, deliberate tapping against the thin nylon of our tent. I felt my stomach drop. The sound wasn't random, not like the wind or falling pine needles. It was purposeful. I turned toward Dad's side of the tent, expecting him to wake up. But he was snoring, oblivious to everything. I swallowed hard and reached for my flashlight. My hand was shaking as I clicked it on. With slow, careful movements, I unzipped the tent door just enough to peek outside. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees, the fire pit, the trunks stretching up into the night. Nothing. Just as I started to relax, Lily grabbed my wrist so hard it hurt. "There," she whispered. Her voice was so small I barely heard it. I followed her gaze, lifting the flashlight higher, and then I saw them. Eyes. Not one pair, not two, more. They glowed in the darkness, far up in the trees, too high for any person to be standing there. And they weren't clustered together like a group of animals. No, these were spaced apart, wide and unnatural, watching us. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The beam of my flashlight trembled as I stared, trying to understand what I was looking at. The longer I stared, the more I realized they were blinking, not in sync, not like eyes that belonged to a single creature. They were independent, separate. Then, from somewhere deep in the forest, I heard it. Click, click, click. A sound that made my bones vibrate. It wasn't like an insect or an animal. It was deliberate, something intelligent mimicking a noise that didn't belong in this world. The eyes didn't move, didn't flinch, just watched. I dropped the flashlight. My body finally broke free of its paralysis, and I scrambled backward, yanking Lily with me. I fumbled with the tent zipper, pulling it closed in a panic, as if that thin layer of fabric could protect us from whatever was out there. Lily started crying. I clamped a hand over her mouth, pressing a finger to my lips. She nodded, her small body shaking against mine. We stayed like that for what felt like hours. I don't remember falling asleep, but I must have, because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through the tent fabric. I bolted upright. Lily was curled against my side, still clutching my arm. Dad was already outside, tending to the fire. For a moment, I thought I had imagined the whole thing. Just a nightmare. That's all. Then I stepped outside. The trees around our campsite were marked. Deep, ragged claw marks gouged into the bark, circling our tent like a warning. Dad frowned when he saw my face. "You okay, kid?" I pointed to the marks. "Well, what did that?" He squinted, stepping closer, ran a rough hand over the scratches. "Bear, maybe. Looks fresh." I wanted to tell him, wanted to explain what Lily and I had seen, but I knew he wouldn't believe me. He'd just tell me I had an overactive imagination, that I needed to stop watching scary movies. But Lily knew. She looked at me across the campfire, her face still pale, her hands clenched into fists. We never spoke about it. Not to Dad, not to anyone. And we never went camping again.